Welcome, my cunning wargamers, to the dark and dank swamps of the mortal realms, because today we are talking all about the Kruleboyz as we continue our exploration of the Orruk Warclans battle tome. I want to say thank you so much to Games Workshop for sending this over to me, and this video is special because it's our first glimpse into the faction that's going to be acting as our antagonist, I guess you would say, for a bit. What I mean is that when the Stormcast and Nighthaunt box came out for the last edition, death was an overarching theme and setting and vibe for the entire Soul War series, and it seems like the Kruleboyz are setting that tone for the Dawnbringer Crusades or the Era of the Beast, however we want to call this next chapter. So I am so excited to dive in and explore what makes the Kruleboyz unique amongst the Orruks of the realms. Now, one thing I like to add right up top here, if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider using the affiliate link in the description down below. Noble Knight Games is a great store here in the US with discounts all over their Games Workshop products, and using that link in the description goes a long way to supporting me, my wife, and this channel. It's life-changing stuff and I super appreciate it. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or the Kruleboyz as a faction, because they are distinct, the Kruleboyz, as said, are the latest kind of combatants to enter the mortal realms. And building off what we learned in my last video, the start of this series, there are two sides to the deity Gorka Morka. Brutal but cunning is Gork, who's very straightforward with melee punches to the face, and then there's Mork, who is cunning but brutal, who uses deception and tricks and taunts and all these kinds of things to win the day. The Kruleboyz, as a faction themselves, are really going to embody that latter part, specifically Mork, to the point where they're sometimes called Morruks, which is kind of a funny term, but they really lean into guile and trickery and traps and winning by any means necessary. In fact, more so than any other Orruk we've seen before, these really are their own subspecies. Like, they're physically built different. Their heads are not kind of like midway down their torso. They have long bodies, short legs. They're more human-like, sort of in like an uncanny valley type space. And they reside largely in the swamps, bogs, and bayous of the mortal realms, at home in the naturally dangerous environments, and that's a big note to hit for them that we're going to discuss later on. Because when we look at the way that Orruks operate, in a general sense, right, including all the sub-factions, they don't use their environment a lot. They travel through it. There are some notable exceptions, like Icebone's Warclan using ice from a particular, mountain formation, but that's really it. But here, we have a sub-faction of Orruks that have adapted physically and technologically to match the environment that they live in. They have the perfect camouflage. They use the beasts of burden that are in their natural environments. They use the poisons, the fungal growths, and the shroud of secrecy that the swamps provide. They even build these elaborate bases. They don't really do forts in the traditional sense, but they're essentially these crazy awesome tree houses and gantryways between thick forests. And so their territory can span miles and you'll never even see them, which is exactly how that they like it. They don't believe in permanent structures like towers and things like that, but they can exude their power and their influence over a huge amount of area. But there's more going on here than just, quote unquote tricksy orcs. This idea of the Mork influence runs really deep. They view honor as laughable. It's like a fair fight is one where you have one, hand tied behind your back, because if you want to win, there's no honor. You just do whatever it takes to win. Their battles for leadership are going to be much more subtle, like, say, assassination in the middle of the night kind of a thing, rather than like a traditional, like, two Iron Jaws walk into a ring and one walks out and that guy's the leader kind of a deal. This is going to have a lot more nuance to it, and they're going to be like backstabbing in a subtle way, not just literally punching each other in the face. But on that note, that's a great segue to the first point I have for them, and that is that we mentioned in my first video, my introduction, that the idea of might makes right, that the biggest orcs are in charge, is an idea that all Orruks share, and at first glance, it might not seem like that's the case here, because none of the Kruleboyz are the biggest or the strongest of Orruks in general. So how do they view might and therefore leadership and so on? For a brief moment, I thought that the shamans would be the leaders. Like when we were first getting our initial glimpses of this faction through previews, I was like, oh, okay, it's kind of like how they have the Wargog Prophet for the Bone Splitters. There's a wizard in charge, and it kind of flips the script on what makes something mighty. But in actuality, there's something a lot more interesting happening here. Internally, within a tribe, they still decide authority by size and strength. Even if they aren't as physically mighty as their Ironjaws or Bone Splitter cousins, they still choose the biggest among them, and that guy's in charge. But their concept of might extends further than the Ironjaws or the Bone Splitters could grasp, because the Kruleboyz have adopted psychological warfare into their, primal arsenal. Might makes right is the law of the land. But what if you could control how mighty others think that you are? The Ironjaws would demonstrate their might by fighting, by getting bigger. Their literal melee prowess is the show of might. But for Kruleboyz, they wreck their opponents so utterly and completely that by the time their warriors actually reveal themselves, the enemy is so shattered that they seem mightier. They seem like the end of the world. If you are on the defending side and you've been enduring their attacks for months, you're going to feel like the Kruleboyz are the ultimate enemy, even though they are some of the weaker orcs physically. They project this image and aura of terror so deeply and fully that they can essentially assert dominance over the world around them. And this is all essentially the closest an orc can come to creative thinking. I mean, because the methods of projecting your faction's might are going to look like traps, hit and run tactics, pulling your enemy apart, like scattering their forces, assassinations, not to mention poisoning, impenetrable fog, and auditory illusions. My point is, in practice, you may have a city of thousands of free guild soldiers and a warband of Kruleboyz numbering 200-300. But if those thousands of soldiers are sleep deprived, full of nightmares, hear screaming every night for weeks, they're wreathed in fog so it blocks out the sun, their supply lines are getting ambushed so they're beginning to starve, their water well is poisoned, all these sneaky, nasty little tricks to destabilize, attack, and terrorize, the enemy breaks them down. And so what is essentially a small band of orcs having a laugh seems to the enemy, to the Free Guild in this example, as a suffocating shroud of horror that they cannot escape. It makes them seem mighty. Now at this point, one thing that I really want to re-emphasize here is the use of the natural environment, and it's actually one of the coolest things about them in my opinion. Because at first, I thought that they were limited to swamps, right? It says they come out of the swamps and that's about it, and it's like, okay, well, swamps have a habit of not moving a whole lot, why are they so scary then? And there's a few reasons. First off, the shamans literally bring the swamp with them wherever they go, right? The world around them molds to the taste of the Kruleboyz. Firm soil becomes wet marsh with boots that get stuck in. Trees grow thick and gnarled to hide the boys in. It's like a swamp version, I guess, of the Ether Sea from the Deepkin, just in the sense that they carry their biome of choice with them wherever they go. So right off the bat, you have a faction that's kind of swamp themed, but they're not limited geographically to them. But the other important thing is Cragnose. It was the rise of Cragnose that saw the Kruleboyz finally creep out of their swamps, and the reason is simple. It's the time of destruction, and the Kruleboyz smell opportunity. Now, I covered the story of them in Dominion, and also a set called the Amberstone Watch, where essentially they wanted to use Cragnose as a pawn to kickstart a huge rampage, which is awesome. I'll leave the link to that in the description down below. Really a fun story. But that's the kind of mentality here, and I kind of lump Cragnose into using their environment because more so than any other orcs, they're looking outward at what's going on in the world, and they're trying to use those events, whether those events are a stampede of creatures or Cragnose erupting from a mountain, all these kinds of things, they want to use those. Everything's a tool. So you have that mentality of X event happens, how can we make this an opportunity? And manipulating Cragnose is the macro of that, but the micro would be stuff like poisoning a water well because they understand the importance of having drinkable water to the forces of order. And I'll mention it here, there's a great scene in the novel Dominion where they unleash a whole stampede of monsters to rush a keep that is still being built, and it's just absolute carnage and madness. It seems really, really cool. And all of these reasons go into explaining just why they're so dangerous. It's cunning, but not in the same way that we see from like the Gloomspite Gits or even other orcs, because there are Ironjaws and Bone Splitters that both lean towards the Morky side of things. This is different. This is elaborate traps. There's forethought and planning like Cragnose. I guess planning's kind of in quotes there, but you know what I mean. There's environmental control, there's weapons, and most of all, there's psychological warfare, this projection of terror and might in favor of physically developing those traits. And in the era of the Dawnbringer Crusades, this is a horrible development because essentially these crusades that are meant to go out and start new cities have become like the prime targets of the Kruleboyz. Essentially, if you didn't read the book Dominion, when a crusade leaves its main city, it has to travel for sometimes quite a while, depends on where they're going, but there is a moment when they stop at the location that they want to establish this new city, and they're tired from their trip and the defenses are not built yet. So there's this weird in-between period where they're done traveling, but they're not fortified. This is without a doubt the favorite time for the Kruleboyz to strike because they're already tired and broken, so they can just mess with these survivors, these Dawnbringer crusades. They can terrorize them with screams in the night or laughing coming from the woods all around them, pull forces apart, poison things, all this kinds of stuff. They have an absolute blast. Like a Dawnbringer crusade coming out of a city is like someone starting to lower the piñata at a party and they're just like, yes, this is going to be epic. And of course, the idea of like starting and settling new cities really seems to be the direction we're going with kind of the Age of Sigmar meta narrative right now as far as like what the next chapter is. It's about expansion and how the realms push back against that. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Now I'm going to end this video the way I end all of them, talking about why I think that these are cool. And I'll be honest with you guys, I went on record as saying I didn't really care for the Kruleboyz when we first started getting teasers. The models just, you know, the actual like individual orcs don't really grip me, but I love the monsters and stuff they ride. That being said, their lore is some of the most compelling and I find it incredibly interesting. It's described that like not only is it just they happen to enjoy the more tricksy side of things, being cunning and stuff, but it's almost a compulsive aspect to them, right? Sometimes it would be easier to just take your warband and attack a small settlement because you can win very quickly, but they just get fixated on these games of torturing people and like all these very complex machinations and things like that. So it's the game, right? The game, the hunt, and the torture that brings them joy. And if you want to see what that's like, I really truly recommend you read Dominion by Darius Hanks. It's the one we just covered recently for the book club, and I love the book. I know a lot of people wish that the Kruleboyz had shown up more, but I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but essentially you get a sense of how they attack things because they're constantly in the shadows harassing and distracting and all these things, so you get a first-hand perspective of what it's like to be attacked by these guys, and it's brutal. But the one thing they didn't have in that novel that I think is really fleshed out by a little bit of this lore section, but also just the model range, is the way that the Kruleboyz work with other creatures way more than any other orcs. Like, the Bone Splitters will ride boars, Ironjaws will ride big boars, but that's about it. I mean, there's some other odds and ends here and there throughout history, depending on how far back your model collection goes with GW, but ultimately, like, they don't diversify their portfolio of vehicles and beasts of burden, but the Kruleboyz do. They incorporate all kinds of monsters because they're so, I guess, in tune with their environment, with the beasts around them, and they use them, and they think creatively about how to turn this into an opportunity for a cool attack. And I think we were missing that a bit. I think, like, you know, Grotz obviously use their environment a lot, quite a bit with, like, the squigs and the spider fang and that kind of stuff. But I feel like the orcs didn't have that, and now they do. And I totally get why people are in love with this faction. Like, I'll do another dedicated video to them later on covering, like, how they make formations for an army and go to the individual units. But at surface level, like, just in the bulk of the lore I'm reading, I'm just like, man, these guys seem like so much fun and like a dark kind of humor, but also it never loses that menacing flavor. Anyway, let me know what your favorite unit is. I would love to hear about it, and we can chat about it. Like I said, we're going to do dedicated videos in the future about each sub-faction within the Kruleboyz that you can take, as well as the various units and things like that. So tell me what you're excited for, and we will get to that later. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.